pleasure to greet you tonight on the occasion of this panel discussion, which we named as Narrowing Spaces of Critical Thinking and Acting. I'm very happy to be here today with our guests, which I'm going to introduce a little bit later. I know that you all are looking forward to hear from them. But before that, I would just like to briefly thank to those who enabled all this event and who are supporting us for many years in our endeavors, to Heinrich Bell Stiftung, Office Serbia, Montenegro and Kosovo, and to Belgrade Youth Center, who was so kind to offer us this room tonight. Before I continue, I would like to invite Simon Else, Director of HBS Stiftung here, Heinrich Bell Stiftung, to say a few words of welcome to you. Yes, please.
Hvala svima. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for turning out in such a large number and for your interest of tonight's panel discussion. We're very honored to host this evening together with you, Professor Butler, and dear panelists. Congratulations again for the honorary doctorate that was awarded to you this morning. I can say without a doubt that your lecture this morning resonated a lot with what this foundation, Heinrich Bell Stiftung, stands for, as a foundation that emerged out of a political tradition of women's movements, ecological movements, and the peace movement in now over 40 years ago in Germany, and as an international foundation and a network that works all around the world, we do feel and experience the topic of tonight's discussion, which is shrinking spaces for civil society and academia in many different contexts, and be it in Turkey, Brazil, Hong Kong, China, in different places. We work in over 60 countries with 33 offices, and very often the mechanics of this oppression and limiting of free thought and expression is the same, which is stigmatizing elites, stigmatizing intellectuals whenever they offer critique or they speak their mind freely, stigmatizing them as the enemy of the state or as the enemy of their people. And what it leads to is very often polarization, even self-censorship among these intellectuals. And we are proud, and we're trying constantly worldwide in our work to push back and to be the foundation of space, to provide space for dialogue, for critical thinking, for exchange, to understand another person's viewpoint, and to get in dialogue, because we believe that is eventually what leads to an advancement and to real progress of a society. So thank you again. We're proud to support our partners worldwide, and we're proud to support the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, especially tonight, that we are cooperating with for quite some time. And we're proud to support these partners worldwide that actually stand true to what this morning you defined very well as the ultimate mission of humanities, which is putting in question conventions, putting in question different norms, and imagining and acting together for a future of how we want to live in this world and how we want to live with one another. Enjoy the discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Simon. Can you hear me now? Yes? Thank you very much for your support, and I hope this long-standing partnership will continue in future years. And I really hope that we are going to have cooperation on some brighter topics than we have tonight. As you may imagine from the title of this discussion, we are going to speak a little bit about freedom of the thought, about the role of university in this freedom of the thought, academic freedom, but also beyond that. We are going to speak how can we basically help those who are struggling for academic freedom and for freedom of expression to be more, let's say, effective, to be more successful. I'm here tonight with two hats. I am representing in the same time Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, the institution which last year celebrated 50 years from its inception. Although it's registered in 1992, basically we were conceived in student rebellion during 1968. And several years after that rebellion, our founders were removed from university with lex specialis. And thanks to huge international support back then, in 1981, Center for Philosophy and Social Theory was founded as a kind of a shelter for those expelled professors. And in a way, we are a place of resistance, place of critique, and place of dissent. And as such, we continue to be quite, let's say, quite problematic for regimes which are leaning toward autocracy. Tonight, I would like also to say that I'm representing something which is newly emerging. That's a network of academic solidarity and engagement, which came to basically to existence after several quite severe, I would say, attacks on academia here that are coming from different institutions, let's call them institutions, ruled by the governing elite for the moment, from the parliament. I'm sure that you have heard about that, even from the president of Serbia. And having in mind how we were named as false elite, this network has a symbolic acronym in Serbian, which means MASA, or mass in English. And it was really interesting to observe what is the reaction of this acronym, because people who are coming from my field, from social sciences, humanities, they always think about MASA as something opposite to elite, which was a part of what we wanted to achieve. So we didn't want to, for academic community to be observed as elitist in this society. Basically, in a way, it is not elitist. But on the other side, when you speak with those who are coming from natural sciences, the first impression is its weight. It's not opposite to it. It's something which is meaningful, something which is heavy in a way. So our words should have some weight. So I'm representing here also this, let's say, founding board of MASA today, and I'm basically greeting you all on behalf of these two organizations or institute and the network which is coming to life very soon. I want to now introduce panelists, which we are so lucky to have tonight in this not so lucky topic. I'm sure that many of you came to hear and see Judith Butler, our honorable guest, who received honorary PhD today, honoris causa, here in Belgrade, and we are very much happy to have her here. Judith Butler is Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at University of California, Berkeley. She's author of several significant works and articles in the field of gender studies, critical theory, political philosophy, and ethics. She has received several awards for outstanding academic contribution to the humanities, feminist, and moral philosophy. She's also an activist for human rights, the person who strongly advocates anti-war politics, non-violence, radical democratic principles, and I would also add academic freedom. She is co-director of the International Consortium Critical Theory Programs at University of California, Berkeley, and we are quite, I would say, honored to be part of this consortium and the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory here. Thank you very much for joining and accepting to be part of this debate discussion tonight. Then we have Ivan Vejvoda. We have a rare opportunity in Belgrade to have Ivan Vejvoda also as a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences from Vienna. Before joining the Institute in 2017, he was Senior Vice President for Programs at German Marshall Fund of the United States. Before that, he served as Executive Director of Balkan Trust for Democracy, which is the program of German Marshall Fund for this region, dedicated to strengthening democratic institutions in the region. And before that, he was also serving in the Serbian government and senior advisor on foreign policy and European integration to Prime Minister late Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić and also Zoran Živković. And before that, I think he was with us in very crucial moments, or at least something we believed at the point were crucial moments. During 2000, he was serving as a director of Belgrade-based Fund for Open Society, which had a great role in assisting democratic changes here. Thank you very much for also accepting to join us. Then we are happy here to have Athena Athanasiou, Professor of Social Anthropology and Gender Theory at Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences from Athens in Greece. She authored recently the book which is dealing with something which is a dissent community here in Serbia about women in black. And she's quite familiar with our context, having in mind this. Her research interests include gender, feminist and queer theory, biopolitics, technologies of the body, anti-militarist movements, affect, nationalism, and memory. Thank you, Athena, for also being here with us. Next one is our dear friend, Sanja Bojanić, Executive Director of the Center for Advanced Studies for Southeast Europe from University of Rijeka, which is our basically key and long-standing partner in our organizing many things in our field here in Belgrade, but also throughout the region. She also teaches in the Academy for Applied Art in the same university. She mentors and supervises several field studies and projects on gender, education, family, and poverty in the region. Thank you, Sanja, for accepting to be part here. And last but not the least, my dear colleague from the Institute, Adriana Zaharijević, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, but also Assistant Professor of Gender Studies at the University of Novi Sad. I think she's quite familiar to all of you, or you're familiar with her work. She published on different topics within political philosophy, like critique of liberalism, feminist philosophy, violence, but also engagement studies, agency, translation, and critique as engagement. Thank you, Adriana. So, basically, tonight we are going to discuss several issues. I already said it's about university and academic community as a place of critical thought. We want to inquire, can we observe university as a place of critical thinking in the times of neoliberal reason? On one side, it's organized to sustain the system as it is, but on the other side, it clearly represents a threat that need to be subjugated and co-opted. We also live in the times of a populist rise, where universities by definition, as we could see from some also outlets in our media, are seen as part of the elite, where those who own some kind of advanced knowledge are disregarded and their voice is silenced with the plenty of other voices. These supposed needs of the so-called ordinary man, a supposed representative of real and true people, are raised to pedestal. Both here in Serbia, but not only here. Unfortunately, we are witnessing similar paths in different parts of the world, in those countries that are clearly with authoritarian rule, in those who we may call defective democracy as Turkey or Hungary, or those that claim to be true liberal democracies like United States, basically. we can hear naming and shaming of those voicing critical attitudes as the enemies of the people. And having in mind this global context, which is not encouraging for us, I would like to ask the first question to Judith. You have been so engaged in many initiatives for defending the academic freedom that sometimes turned also into defending the right to personal freedom, not only academic freedom. You have followed carefully the cases in Turkey, in Brazil, in Iran, in other places in the world. You have been engaged to many networks that were supporting these cases. And today you're here to support us also in struggling for academic freedom. And thank you very much for that. But tell us, is this vulnerability of academia, of academic community of university, the first indicator of democratic decline? Or we could say it's heavily under its way when it happens? What do you think from the perspective of somebody who is familiar with many cases?
Well, there are some real challenges to universities right now, and they are producing a change in the structure of the university. The more universities are bringing in corporations and outside money to keep themselves afloat, the more states, corporations, or sometimes religious authorities believe that they have a right to come in and tell universities what they should be teaching, which departments they should have, what curriculum they should have, what can be taught inside the classroom. So in my mind, it's never been more important to preserve the academic freedom of universities. And by that, I don't mean just the individual freedom of people who happen to be inside universities. Academic freedom belongs to faculty. And in a way, it belongs to students, but in a separate way. It belongs to faculty because we have been trained in fields. We have been trained in ways of thinking and interpreting. We have standards that we bring to bear on scholarship. What is good evidence? What's a good argument? What's a publishable piece? We make these judgments all the time on the basis of our education in the field and our continuing engagement in the fields with which we work. Now, if somebody comes in and says, I don't like what you're doing, but they're actually not within the field, but they don't like what you're doing because it's offensive to somebody's religion, or it's offensive to whoever is in state power, or the corporations that will give us more money don't want to see us espousing views of this kind, or foreign countries that we're trying to have invest in us through collaborations of various kinds, and I know the Balkans knows this well. They are putting limits on what can be taught and what cannot be taught. There are many exchanges with China at the present moment where there have to be real arguments about curriculum and whether the faculty trained in any number of places in the world who are in Chinese studies are free to teach the history of China as they understand it, or political culture in China. So there are many different interests that are trying to work their way into the curriculum, the classroom, the tenure review process. And academic freedom really says it is up to those who have been appointed on the basis of their professional credentials to make those decisions and to exercise the freedom to produce a course or a curriculum according to their best judgment. And I think that students also clearly have a different kind of right, which is that they have a right to be exposed to a wide range of knowledge and to be trained to think well about what they're reading, what they're learning, to come up with judgments that are based on evidence and clearly formulated and persuasive because they're consistent and coherent. They have a right to have exposure to that material and to think it through and to find their way and to come up with their own point of view, right? It doesn't have to be the same point of view as the professor. I mean, if a professor wants you, it only gives you a good grade because you reproduce that professor's point of view. That is not okay. Okay, I'm just telling you. But, you know, because there are these financial and religious and state-based interests in the university, many people are trying to decide what can be taught, how it can be taught, what should be censored, who should be allowed to teach, who should not be allowed to teach. And we need to keep faculty power over those issues. And that is academic freedom. It is the freedom of the faculty to exercise judgment on academic issues. Similarly, and I'll be brief, when faculty break their obligations to their job, to their students, when they're guilty of harassment or they don't grade fairly or they are turn out not to be knowledgeable in the field, or they propagate myths that are not grounded knowledge. They also come up for review, but they're reviewed by faculty, right? It's our job to decide among ourselves whether we are still doing our job well, who should be promoted and who should not, who should be sanctioned, right? Who should be suspended. There has to be a faculty presence in that kind of process because we are self-governing. So academic freedom is also a principle of faculty self-governance. Of course, we don't decide everything about the university. We don't decide all the finances. We don't decide all the infrastructure. But anything related to the academic program is, strictly speaking, a matter of academic freedom, and there must be faculty input for that to be legitimate. And this is extremely important to understand it, and a great deal has been written on the difference between, say, individual liberty to say what you want in the town square and academic freedom to teach as you deem it important to teach on the basis of your knowledge. Now, you could say that's elitist. All I'm saying is that some of us studied science and have some things to say about it. Some of us have studied philosophy and have some things to say about it. And when students come to the university, they want to know that you're knowledgeable, right? So it's a credential. It's not necessarily an elitism, but it is a credential that is well earned. We had to rewrite our dissertations. We had to have people tell us, you know, a million times what had to be changed. We had to send our material out for review and get back the comments and do the revisions and, right? I mean, it's tough work getting formed and trained, you know, in a field, and then taking the risk of maybe becoming interdisciplinary and people not liking that so much, but still trying to press the boundaries of knowledge so that it's more capacious. In any case, I do think that an academic engagement committee such as the one you have is extremely important, because otherwise every time a single faculty member has a problem, right, they're being censored, they're being threatened, they're being harassed, their review has not been just. They shouldn't have to be alone. There actually has to be a network of support that can re-articulate the principles of academic freedom and bring that forth. So in the US, we have the American Association of University Professors. And every time there is a problem, we're on the phone. They have 3 lawyers, right? They call you back. They give you the data. They tell you all the legal cases. They send you the lawyer, right? But it's a political organization, but it's an organization that represents the legitimate interests of faculty and their rights of academic freedom. And there are many of these throughout the world. The European Union has one, which I wish were a little stronger, quite frankly. Maybe you could help make it stronger. But there are many of these along the world, and it's this kind of network that makes it possible for individuals to come forward. No one should be a heroic individual in these matters.
Thank you very much. That was basically our idea with forming this network, that we are not alone, and together we can really make some changes which are defending academic freedom. Ivan, you have been one of the key figures of democratic transition in Serbia. As I already said, you led Fund for Open Societies in some moments which were, in a way, revolution in our recent history. You also advised prime ministers, led German Marshall Fund programs, all-time investing efforts into democratization. However, unfortunately, we could say that now, at least, there are many indicators saying that we are again on backsliding paths when it comes to democracy. Comparatively speaking, is this shrinking the space for critical thinking in Serbia a reflection of the wider trends in Europe, and how it's a reflection of wider trends of Europe? Is there something very specific, some local flavor in Serbia, or you can say that this is like just happening, what is happening in many other places in Europe and beyond Europe?
Thank you very much, Gazella, and thank you to the Institute for the invitation and to Heinrich Böll for sponsoring this. And it's really a deep and great honor to be on this panel with Judith, Athena, Sonia, and Adriana. Let me preface my words because this is also an emotional moment, because the last time I spoke here was during the panels of the other Serbia, Druga Serbia, in 1992-93. And let me just mention those who are not here. Among those, Radomir Konstantinovic, Borka Pavicevic, Aljoša Mimica, my friend and colleague. And so, you know, we keep coming back to these themes. And I'd like to say that the issue, as in fact Judith just alerted us, academic freedom is part of a broader freedom of civic liberty and of political freedom. I mean, it's at moments it's hard to distinguish this, and obviously there are markers, but the mere name of university comes from universality, it comes from universal values. So it is about learning the fact that we are one humanity and that we have a core set of values without which we would not be here where we are today. I mean, you know, you go back to the Renaissance and, you know, the early universities that began in Europe then that looked at the dignity of human beings, the philosophers in Florence and throughout Europe fought their way to show that the individual was the core of everything and not some transcendental being above us, whether king or God. And then, of course, during the Enlightenment and the democratic revolutions, this came very strongly to the fore with the creation of modern democratic societies. And the whole political philosophy of both socialism and liberalism, I would put those in a big basket together, because these were ways in which people were seeking paths towards reinforcing freedom through institutions of different kinds. Some slanted more to social issues, others to more political, or combining the two. So when we are in 2019 and we have countries like Turkey where professors have been either expelled from the country or put in jail, civic leaders who are facing lifelong sentences, this is very dramatic. Or somewhat closer to home, Hungary, where the government of Viktor Orban expelled a university. I mean, that was unconceivable when 1989 happened. The Central European University has had to move to Vienna. And in addition to that, for example, gender studies have been banned by the government. I mean, this is something really that defies belief. What is it that's wrong with gender studies and that they need to ban it? And even more dramatically, a law that punishes people who help homeless people. Now that is the very basis of human solidarity, to help a being in need on the street or a refugee that's trying to save him or herself from a war or from dire economic circumstances. So we are definitely generally in a backsliding position. I mean, no need to mention Hong Kong and other things that are constantly in the press. And so the task of defending academic freedom never ends. I would say even in so-called normal times, because there is always the danger that somebody will try to curtail those freedoms. Here in this country, you specifically asked, we obviously have a closing or severe control of the broader media space. It's not that there aren't free media spaces, but there are those that are read or watched by a minority of people. Fortunately, no one's in prison of our professors or of our researchers, and I think one needs to make that distinction. Not everything is as bad as somewhere else. It is far from perfect, but I think a lot depends also, if you want, on the way in which the state addresses these issues. Does the state give enough money for a valid university program, for research across all fields? Because this is the difficult long-term work of a state, to invest in its own potential, in its human potential. The fact that a lot of people are leaving, and not only young academics who have their diplomas, but electricians and plumbers. And we cannot distinguish that, because we're losing a sort of substance at various levels. And I would put it to you that the demographic decline, which includes the aging of the population, the decline of the population, and the drain of people, is probably one of the most dramatic facts that we are facing. And it's not only our country, it's the whole region. 3.5 million people have left Romania. 3.5 million have left Romania in the past 10 years. So we are part of a bigger dynamic, and I think ways to address it, it is just like the association that you mentioned. We have to network, we have to join hands, and we need to support each other. Historically, the Pen Club was created to defend writers who were put in jail across the world. There are many examples. We are not doing anything new, but we need to do it with a new vigor, because the dangers out there are constant. And if we do not stand up and speak very clearly that the academic freedom, civic freedom, and political freedom are the bases of a healthy, open, and modern society, we will go further in a regressive direction.
Thank you very much for that message. I think it's really important for having in mind for us. Now I turn to Athena. I wonder some things, having in mind that our institute was a place where many of those who were political leaders emerged from. Political leaders coming from both sides on both sides in 90s. Basically, we had our founder Mihailo Markovic, who was supporting regime, basically, who was one of ideologies of the regime. On the other side, we had three key persons of democratic changes coming from at some point coming from university, from institute. Zoran Đinđić started his professional life basically at the institute as philosopher, also Vojislav Koštunica, who was one of the rectors, and Dragoljub Mićunović, also one of the founders. And having in mind that sometimes it's maybe not easy to distinguish between political, social, and academic engagement, sometimes this line is blurred. I wonder, having in mind your experience with Greek intellectual scene and Syriza especially, you have been part of these circles who were close basically to Syriza. Can you tell us a little bit more about this very specific country case, which in a way challenged the establishment hegemony in Europe? What was the role of academia and this intellectual community in this specific case? Basically, is it possible for somebody who is coming from academia, who is trying to stay also academic representative, to have some impact on political actors, but stay out of the politics, as a dirty word here, probably in many other cases?
Well, thank you, Gazella. Thank you all for being here. It's a great honor for me to be here on this panel. Many thanks to the Institute and to the Heinrich Bell Stiftung. Let me start from the last sentence of your question. You're asking if there is anything wrong in blurring these lines between political, social, and academic engagement. I would say no. In my opinion, there's nothing wrong in blurring those lines of demarcation. I actually believe that it's always possible to take sides while at the same time disrupting and disorienting and reordering, if you will, the available sides or the straight lines of demarcation and association. And in fact, I think it's always possible and probably necessary also to be able to take critical sides within the side in which one has positioned oneself. Here we are. I just described my own positionality in terms of your question about my contribution to among other intellectuals, to the rise of left in Greece. And this is to say that this did not come without its own ambivalences and nuances and impossibilities too, and obviously defeats too. But I would say, since we're here addressing this very thorny question of how to deal with this narrowing of critical spaces, I think it's fair to say that this has to do with the way in which intellectuals play a role in the rise of the left in Greece. And I think it's, this first left-wing government ever elected in a European Union member state in 2015, I think became the first government in Europe to criticize, to question neoliberal orthodoxy, neoliberal hegemony, by seeking to end the cycle of austerity, by refusing to extend the bailout loan cycles, and most importantly, by creating new configurations of democratic politics in Europe. I think that was the main wager of Syriza. It was nothing less than a kind of refoundation of Europe. There was nothing anti-European about Syriza politics. This is another misunderstanding that's lurking. I think actually it's very important to remember that it was the left which defended Europe against its resurfacing and resurging enemies. I think it was all about a call to democratic agonism against neoliberal governmentality and post-democracy, which is another very important problem that we need to bear in mind. But I think, let me try to focus on the part of your question that concerns political and academic engagement. Let me just say that I think that we are always already engaged, always. I mean, in spite of us, prior to all volitional, decisional acts of engagement. So it's not up to us to decide whether or not we are engaged, because we are already. The question is how we can become engaged, how we can become critically engaged. That is, how we can become answerable to social norms, social conventions. I think that's about what we can call, following Judith's work, performativity of engagement, which to my mind implies the indeterminate forces of critical responsiveness, of persistence, resistance. I think it would be interesting to think further about the way in which this always already being engaged and becoming engaged would be an interesting topic, but it's definitely it's a philosophical one. I will leave it for another occasion, but I think it's important, at least for me, not to conflate engagement with free-willed agency. I think it's always important to bear in mind our own vulnerability to power, our vulnerability as scholars, as activists, as political thinkers and actors. And I think it's always important to remember something that Judith has unraveled extensively in her work, that the performativity of critical engagement is always implicated in the nexus of the power which we seek to contest. And I think this is about the paradox of subjectivation, that it's an important issue here when we talk about engagement. And as you put it very well before in your introduction, I think engagement is not a matter of a kind of heroic, agency, individualistic agency. It's all about the way in which we can be enabled by each other. And I think the question is, therefore, what critical theories, critical thinking, critical subjectivities also can do today in these cruel times that we call the present, despite the suffocating limitations of the present. Well, since I mentioned this word, I have to admit that I'm totally obsessed with this political concept of suffocation lately. I think the political charge of suffocation and breathing resonates very well with Frantz Fanon's statement, I think it was in 1952, that the oppressed people revolt because it becomes impossible for them to breathe. And let me just say that we're therefore recalled of Eric Garner's murder by a chokehold applied by police officers while he pleaded for a breath of air 11 times in 2014. As we all know, a whole movement emerged out of this appeal for breathing. I'm talking about the movement Black Lives Matter, and it's astonishing to me that thousands of marchers took to the streets chanting Eric Garner's last words, "I can't breathe." So I think it's important to think this figure of breathing and suffocating as a politicized idiom of survival and resistance, either within the academy or outside it.
Thank you very much. I think this issue of breathing is really important, and my personal feeling is that these issues of solidarity and engagement actually do emerge when we are not able to breathe. And I think in the recent weeks, we felt somehow that we are under so much pressure as academic community that we cannot breathe academic air, at least. And that's why this network is emerging. So yes, I think you are very, very right in this. But when we come closer to at least what is politically called Western Balkans, when we turn in this case to Croatia, we see that things are really, we know much more on narrowing the spaces for academia, especially. Sonia, last year in Croatia we had a case of our colleagues basically who were authors of analysis of the right-wing movement in Croatia, and at some point they were there was initiative that they should be processed by the ethical committee, based on the claims that they falsely represented this conservative NGO. And that highly resonated also here in Serbia as the issue of closing down the spaces for critical thought. But also your own Center for Advanced Studies has been many times in press under attacks for ethnic impurity of its founders. For Croatian terms, it's not really convenient that you have a Serb, a Bosniak, and Croat who is maybe not real Croat as a founder. And you are living in a country which is part of European Union, like Serbia. And you're also familiar with Serbia as you're quite close to us and cooperate with us. So I would like to ask you, is it easier in European Union to practice academic freedom from your perspective, or do you think it's all the same what is happening throughout the region?
Good evening, and thank you for having me here. And may I start by challenging your question? And also challenging the very title of this debate, shrinking or narrowing the critical spaces. Well, I find it unnatural that critical modality of thinking needs someone else to find a room for its own action. So it's a critical thinking in itself that is making the room for the discourses that are at stake. In this sense, when you invited me to take part in this debate, I thought of Theodor Adorno and his trouble in front of the student protests in 68, 69, a real trouble. And actually, now taking what was happening in late 60s and through our lenses, we may say that Theodor Adorno was right in terms of making spaces for critical thinking against consumerism, against all forms of late capitalism, and somehow having this, well, at that time he was elite, but having this intuition that all that has been preparing during this late 60s will become kind of a corporative academia. Because for him, consumerism was something against free thinking or critical thinking. And his critique, most of you probably read Minima Moralia, well, was preparing some room for what we had in a sense during punk movement, against values that are establishing liberal, neoliberal values that were at stake against individualism, that Athena also now stressed as something that we need to fight before even fighting for some other institutional levels of academic freedom, teaching, and free breathing, and not to suffocate under what we are suffocating. Well, I'm pretty naive but it's this late capitalism that is suffocating us all in many levels of our lives. So also in academia. And being anxious about shrinking the spaces of critical thinking, well, we are here to make some room. We are here to be disobedient in a civil way and enable those who are not able to speak about these freedoms, and now it's a plural, either with our students, either with our colleagues, and now I'll, let's say, land in Croatia, in local communities. Again, with Adorno, you somehow had also a critique of what lately became politics of identity or identity politics. He was against this in its protoform because we don't need any particular identity to stand for a cause or a certain cause. If we accept that we are a multitude, then a particular or unique identity is not important. And it's really not important being Croat or Serbian or Bosnian or Austrian. Let us say it's nice and good to be European when it comes to the resistance part of the being European. So I might say for myself or for my colleagues in Rijeka that we are European and that we stand for certain European ideals that are not only linked and related to Europe as an economic union, but also other values deeper in the past and let's say starting from Greece.
Thank you. I think you gave me very good intro basically into the question on our own role as academic community in making these spaces for critical thinking. And my next question goes to Adriana, having in mind everything which was happening here in recent weeks, months. We somehow had a feeling that academic community became the main political opponent to the regime. And in having such environment, we also, having been also part of this academic community here, we know that majority of its representatives is quite silent, passive, and even self-censored. What do you think, where it comes so much focus then on academic community? Why? What is the case that this is what is happening for the moment?
Thank you, Gazella, but I also, because I'm on the other side of this table, I would like to thank especially the panelists, all of you, because you are today with us. I'm kind of also representative of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and also as a member of MASA. I really need to say thank you for being with us today. This is not only a conversation, this is not only a kind of a way to think through what we can do, how, but also in a way to support something which is happening to us right now. And I would, in that sense, say something about maybe what is happening to us right now, and because the Institute and we always try to do things publicly, to put them out, to be as transparent as possible. And this is also one of the attempts to do that as well tonight. So, as Gazella said, academia has never been so popular as in the last maybe 3 or 4 months, and I don't think that I have to say more to you here and how all that went. It's so obvious that it basically never was like that. There's so many individuals, academic workers, from the rector to the professors to the researchers, have been so openly and even daily harassed in the government-led media. And we can see that the institutions are under fire. So a lot of very shrewd commentators, but only in those very small alternative media, we mentioned them here now, have likened this situation that Serbia is in now with the Trump's US in terms of this contempt or even hatred towards elites. So I was really thinking how it happened that in the last 4 months we are so much under the impression that there is some people and on the other hand some elite. We also hear that it's a false elite, a pseudo-elite, and that the representatives of academic community are those people who are false or pseudo. I was really wondering how that happened, and was it always with us in this long 7 years that we have behind us, and digging through the governmental metaphors or the dominant political speeches, I realized that we can talk about the 3 phases, basically, and this is the last one. So we didn't have this as a kind of a continual, constant state of the affairs. I would remind you of the first one, which we could call Max Weber phase. It was the one 6 years ago, and I would like to call that one the elite-like talk, or a will to belong to the elite, or a will to be embraced by the elite, which referred to a kind of a successful mixture of our own very own Orthodox tradition with, on the other hand, Protestant lust for work and subsequent gain. This was somehow part of the general political discourse only 6 years ago. So it was, in a way, very elitist. Informer, Telegraph, and these kind of yellow press were really digging out some pieces of information about Max Weber, who used to be the favorite social theorist of our president. At the time when we were embracing the entrepreneurial subjectivity and European, or rather, or especially German ways of dealing with things. Then comes the second phase, which we can relate it to 2016, when there was an oppositional candidate for a president who gathered around himself around 100 intellectuals. And then there was a time when we didn't really have quoting and referencing to other Webers, but we had the idea of quantity, basically, of amassing intellectuals. So who had more intellectuals? Whose intellectuals were realer or truer? That was the basic questions. But we were still, in a way, dealing with the elites, probably the competing elites, but we did have the elite. And then this summer happens, and a completely different paradigm is what we are having. It's the same governmental talk. These are the same representatives, basically, the same faces, the same voices, but what they're saying is in a way different. It's a very, very populist strategy. You really hear it in Trump, you really hear it everywhere, I mean, in various places in the world. And it's a very Orwellian double talk also, because it's quite hard to say what the elite really refers to, as much as it's hard to say what the people really refers to, because sometimes, or very often, it is the government or the true elites which somehow liken or equate themselves with the people here. While you were talking, and especially while Athena was talking about suffocating, I remembered the title of a very important book for the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, the book by Petar Bojanić, our director. I cannot remember the full title, because the title is like Kako mi govorimo, hodamo, dišemo, spavamo I radimo svašta zajedno. So how do we walk, talk, breathe, and do a lot of different things together? And the name of the book was basically reflecting the idea of the institution, because the institution to work, we have to be together, and we really have to even breathe together sometime. But if something like this, something which is happening right now, and that is the singling out of individuals from the rector to the professors, so different workers in the academic community, singling them out, making heroes out of them, or rather anti-heroes out of them, also in a way solicits the other amongst us to remain in the shadow, to remain in the so-called apathy, to remain breathing slowly and so that no one hears that we're breathing. And this is not the way a large institution, which is academia or the smaller ones, can or should function. So in a sense, I would say that what we're witnessing right now in this last phase is not the attack on heroic individuals, but the very attack on the institutions themselves and making them less breathable places. And in that sense, if we're thinking about this history of phases, I think that the next one is going to be very bleak if we're letting it happen. So I would stop here with this bleakness.
Thank you, Adriana. You're obviously speaking about something which hurts us a lot here. And what hurt us the most is obviously what we call weakening, capturing, or devastating institutions, what we have. And among them, maybe the most weakened institution here is the state, as someone who should protect also academic freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, personal freedom, any kind of freedom. So we are living for the moment in a context where over knowledge we appreciate more obedience, and basically when we have such situation, then something which is core principle of science and research and also philosophy as their mother, free and open inquiry, is something which becomes non-desirable. This is simply something which is considered as a threat, although we said in the beginning that, or Judith said during her presentation talk today, that there are things, critique shouldn't be considered as something negative per se. Critique, as we understand it, at least when we come from academic community, there is a lot of critique you need to survive in order to become a PhD or to publish anything. Critique needs to be constructive, but obviously we live in the times in this, also in the country where this is not really the case. But having this in mind, having in mind the importance of institution, importance of the strong institution that should somehow protect us, I want to ask you, Judith, about something which is different in our context and maybe in your context. You're coming from the country where let's say the most prestigious universities are private funded. You're coming, yourself is coming from the state university, public university, but still, as we discussed, there is a lot also of the private funding that is coming in. And here in our, basically in our countries, we believe that public funding, state funding, is something which should protect the autonomy, that is guarantee of autonomy. And having these differences in mind, how would you say, how would you evaluate this tension between private and the public? You already said something about importance of faculty and academic institution preserving its power to decide about own things, own curricula, about its affairs, but still, where is the guarantee for autonomy? For us, it's state, but obviously if we are living in a weak state, this is not happening. So how we can basically go back to... You can also...
Well, maybe we should not think of the state as protecting us. Maybe we need a little less protection from the state. Right, because they can be protecting us from, you know, gender or critical theory or democratic politics or critiques of state policy, right? All of which can be generated out of the university. So my view of it is different. I think that we're not bought. When states fund us, or when private organizations fund us, when granting institutions fund us, the Mellon Foundation or the Heinrich Böll, both of which have made so much of our conversation possible, they do not tell us what we can say or not say. They do not determine our point of view. They produce the condition of possibility for us to find our way in a more or less free way, given the constraints on freedom that surely exist for a wide variety of reasons. So a state or a funding organization in giving has to also agree not to intervene. So what I want is I want a non-intervention clause for every funder, right? And in that sense, they give and they restrain themselves according to the nature of that kind of promise that secures academic freedom. So we don't look at them to protect us. We look at them to agree to restrain themselves from intervention. And if they fail, we fight them, right? We fight them. We insist that they cannot intervene on academic matters of that kind. And, but that has to be, to some degree, rigorously contractual. And it also has to be a contract that is given life by being enforced, by being highlighted, by being taught about, by being understood in the public medium as the media as something that is crucial to the not just the integrity, ethical integrity of the university, but to the idea of knowledge as open-ended inquiry. Now, knowledge as open-ended inquiry sounds, it sounds like, it could be Kant. I mean, it doesn't sound like the most radical idea, but open-ended inquiry means you don't always know what you are going to find along the way. It means the mind must be given a certain free play, and there's a Kantian term again. It has to be given a certain kind of free play to find the connections it needs to find, to formulate a new hypothesis, to imagine in another way. And that kind of freedom produces the best intellectual work. I mean, if we're told in advance what the results of our research have to look like, we're in a factory job where we are just, stamping the same stamp or producing the same product. We become part of the reproductive line in a Ford factory. But that is not what we do. And that freedom is frightening. The freedom of open inquiry is frightening, in part because it releases the possibility of open and critical thinking in the public, right? We're not just teaching in our classroom, we're speaking on the radio, we are publishing books that the public reads, we are involved in public discussions that are, technically speaking, extracurricular. We have a wide range of extracurricular activities, including a conversation like this. So there is a link between critical thinking, open inquiry, and even the possibility of political dissent. And when critical inquiry is shut down because, say, it calls into question the authority of a given regime or a given religious institution or a given theoretical point of view or scientific point of view, when it's shut down out of censorship and out of fearful censorship, it becomes clear that it has a kind of power that authorities can be very, very frightened of. But the strongest democratic authorities, I would say, are the ones that handle the robust critique of their own activities, right? Bring it on, right? This is a democratic state. I want to hear all your criticisms. I want to know what's happening. We want to change. We want to revise ourselves. We want to have open and antagonistic debate as part of democratic culture, and that antagonism is a value. It allows us to entertain a wide range of perspectives and to think about organizing the world in another way. So you know, there is that danger of opening up new thought that gets shut down. I would also just take us back for a moment, because critical theory from the Frankfurt School is also, has always been linked to the important tradition of philosophy and social theory here at Belgrade University. And one of the key questions that critical theory posed is, what are the conditions under which we can come to grasp the structure of our historical times? What can be transformed about those structures? Can those structures be transformed? And according to what norms do we seek to transform those structures? So there's a project of social transformation in critique when it asks, like, on what basis are universities structured in this way? On what basis are government institutions or forms of medical knowledge structured in this way? They are asking for an authority to show why it should be regarded as an authority, right? What is the legitimation for this authority? Or is it simply dogmatic? Is it autocratic? Is it simply imposing its will to augment its power, but is not based on a justification or a set of grounds that we can all agree on or all argue about? So when we engage in critical inquiry, we open up those grounds. Let's debate the grounds. What makes a university worth the name, right? What are the grounds? And when people are afraid of politics, they say politics should be outside the university. Well, thought doesn't know very much about the walls of the university. You know, it goes right through. And that's also somewhat dangerous. It's shutting down the classroom, and a topic in a classroom, like gender, is a way to make sure that idea doesn't get out, disseminate into society, and start changing behavior or challenging social structures, institutions, heteronormative organizations of family life, or compulsory heterosexuality of marriage, or alternative kinship arrangements, or alternative sexual arrangements that don't necessarily have much to do with marriage or reproduction. So, I mean, all of that's, you know, like saying it even now, it's like, are the police coming? No, they're not coming. But you know, there is a fear that if it becomes speakable, if it becomes thinkable, if you can write the paper about it, it's going to become legitimate over time, and that will then have social effects. Of course, it does work like that, but it works the other way too. What happens in the classroom, I mean, gender studies, women's studies, was established in response to a movement. It was already, there were many movements in the world, and the movement had a need to become intellectual. What are we doing? On what grounds? What do we mean by gender? What do we mean by freedom? How do we make the claim for the right to abortion or equal pay, right? Then feminists started studying equality, and they started studying autonomy, and they started understanding the relationship between the biological and the cultural, and doing comparative work on labor systems and what is the division of labor that is gendered. I mean, this in many ways, the social movements and what happens in the academy, they move back and forth, and they enrich each other. And you know, there are many activists who get exhausted from their activism and come back and want to study critical theory. And then there are critical theorists who say, I'm sick of this Kant, I'm going out onto the street, right? But I always think that's great. It keeps going like that. It keeps going like that, because you need the regeneration of ideas. You need to know why you're doing what you're doing. You need to be, you know, vitalized through a certain kind of new imagining. At the same time, you need to know what you're doing when you're on the street, right? On the street or in a social movement of some kind. Anyway, that was a long-winded response to your question.
No, it's not. And I think it's really important for us also here to think a little bit more on what is the role of the state, as you mentioned in the beginning, and what is our role, not to expect so many things as many times, at least we as a social scientists hear from the people, ordinary people, not maybe from people from academic community, but from ordinary people, that state should do the things. So I think this is really relevant for our context. Thank you. I'm going back to your experience. You're leading one huge program at EVM that is dealing with futures of Europe. And at this program, you have gathered many, many prominent representatives of academia throughout globally, basically. What would you say, how important is this networking, and how important is, especially for those countries who are facing with the democratic backslide and authoritarian rise, to be part of such networks, to connect and to, let's say that we are more aware about cases like we were very much aware of the Central European University and what happened with it. Could you say that there are more places like that that we do not know maybe about, and how it's important to know about them and to get in touch with such places for keeping this struggle alive?
Absolutely. I mean, it's crucial that there is as much communication as possible between different environments, not only within Europe, but across the globe. Because everywhere where freedom is endangered, academic freedom and critical thinking is endangered, the only way to fight back is to join forces with those others who will publicize to others and create a campaign to do so. So the project that I lead at the Institute in Vienna is one which brings together academics and civic leaders and thinkers from all of Europe. There's a focus on Europe and a focus on the question of regression of democracy and the various challenges that Europe is facing. But allow me just to reflect a little bit from my vantage point on what Judith said, and from our experience in this country that no longer exists, called Yugoslavia. There are some people from my generation here who will recall that, of course, Yugoslavia was the quote-unquote freest of the communist countries. It was not inside the Iron Curtain, it was outside of it. It led a rather independent foreign policy, and there was a level of academic freedom. You know, you could study Western authors that you couldn't in Bulgaria, for example, or Romania. In philosophy, you could go quite a long way. Obviously, the praxis philosophers throughout Yugoslavia hit a wall. The ones in Belgrade, of course, were expelled. My teacher, my professor was Zagorka Golubovic. And we, as students, felt you know, the disaster of putting walls around critical thinking, and thus we were looking for alternative spaces. And again, an international campaign led to the fact that along with the Institute, on behalf of which we're speaking here, there was also the creation of an inter-university center in Belgrade. The Swedish sociologist Johan Galtung led it, and the United Nations made an institution where people could come freely from the rest of the world, and where Yugoslav thinkers and philosophers could come and teach, and this was created in the mid-70s. So again, the result of solidarity of intellectuals and free thinkers around the world, and the Yugoslav regime had to concede because it didn't want to show itself completely as a closed-in nation. And those of us who were in academia or in research institutes, we were part of a what was called a petitionist movement. We signed petitions against people who were put in jail, Article 133 famously known at that time, who were put in jail because of their thinking, because they disagreed. These were people in jail often with whom we disagreed in their thought, but you know, in the famous saying of Voltaire, you know, I don't agree with you, but I will defend you until the end for having the freedom to say what you think. So again, the tradition of the Enlightenment is extremely important. And of course, there was a limit. So what many people perceived in our former country as a sort of freedom, they realized when it broke down that in fact it was also one in which there was a monopoly of political power, and this you were not allowed to touch. There was a monopoly by the Communist Party, and you can study everything from Adorno to Merleau-Ponty and backwards, but if you contested the role of the Communist Party and, of course, of Comrade Tito, then you landed yourself in jail or were ostracized or you were kicked out of university. And so we have felt on our skin what this is, and so many of us who have been in this know what this is about, and then our antennas are alert to those moments when you see that kind of backsliding and the danger that comes along with it when you contest so-called established dogmas. You know, we don't need to talk about Giordano Bruno and Galileo, who contested the dogma of the church, and we know how they ended. Fortunately, we're not, you know, being burnt these days, people who think differently, or, you know, as I said, in Turkey, some people are out there to get...
I was burnt in proxy.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's bad enough. Okay, so we're not out of the woods, as they say on these things. But I would like to, since we've been mentioning critical theory, and Judith is absolutely right, to say that here the Frankfurt School was extremely important in many ways. The book by Adorno and Horkheimer, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, I think is one that still behooves us to think, how is it from ideas of freedom we end in totalitarianism? What is it? What is this mechanism by which, when we've created spaces of freedom, somehow you wake up the next morning and you are within a totalitarian state? My professor in Paris, Miguel Abensour, who unfortunately passed away recently, my professor and close family friend, studied this very deeply, and I hope to eventually write something on that. And as Judith was saying, you know, many of us were through the academic revolving door with the street. And so some of us remained on the street a little longer than we wanted to, and, you know, our careers went in some other direction. But I think it is crucial, you know, when finally on the future, if we do not remember the past and the very evil that can come back to us, as it did in this country, which broke down in a bloody conflict at the end of the 20th century in Europe, then we're not serious about ourselves. And finally, it is, you know, what Hannah Arendt hammered in the most positive sense. It's about understanding. If we do not understand what happened, we will not be able to tackle the kinds of challenges that you are asking us about.
Well, yes, understanding is really important, and that, in my mind, could open many questions about education in general, and how can we make us understand, at least new generation, to understand many things which are crucial for our countries and our context. But that would be a really huge debate. I would like now to turn to Athena and to basically build on what Ivan said about in his program, he is joining academic representatives, but also those who are coming from civil society, leaders from civil society. And you also have written about Women in Black, a specific community of critical thought and acting, I would say more critical acting in Serbia. How important is for us to observe spaces of critiques beyond academia? How significant is for us to make alliances with them in this struggle, and what is your opinion on that, basically?
Thank you, Gazela. This is a very difficult question, obviously. Let me start by reflecting a little bit on what Sonia said before. When Sonia, you mentioned the Theodor Adorno and students' protests, and especially students' protests against Theodor Adorno. As you know, his classes were interrupted, students distributed leaflets. My favorite one, well, that's an ironic formulation, was one which read, "Adorno is a dead institution." That's it. So I think, the students wanted him to be concrete. They wanted him to offer tangible solutions. For me, it's one of the saddest moments of, institutional critique. Adorno talked about actionismus, and it's interesting to think the difference between this specific configuration of protest and other maybe non-violent practices. So I think the question of non-violence is very crucial here. But to get back to your question, I think the task of critical thought is performed both inside and outside the academy. I think it's transversal. It's even beyond the binary between inside and outside. And the question is how to foster this transversal link. And I think the question is how to take up this challenge, which to me is very important, even in its impossibility. It's a very difficult endeavor. It might be impossible in some cases, but I think it's worth taking up the challenge, especially today in a context which so notoriously devalues critical thought, either through neoliberal cutbacks or in contexts where critical thought is attacked or censored by neoconservatives. So, we're talking about counter-textual and counter-critical times. And the question is how to defend these possibilities of critique, in what ways. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I mentioned before the figure of breathing and how it emerges as a politicized idiom of resilience and persistence and resistance. And since you're asking me about my latest book, I'm recalled of the agonistic courage of Zenerd's women in black, activists in this city amidst induced conditions of political devastation, such as war, militarism, nationalism. I think the way in which courage and critique come together is quite important here. There's nothing heroic about the concept of courage, but still there's something quite powerful. Maybe it's a kind of weak power, but still, and standing together in public against all odds was for these activists, as well as for others, a breathing space whereby the air is both a medium and a life-supporting outcome of being together in public against all odds. Neu naše ime was their slogan, not in our name, which is so interesting how it travels among different moments and different movements. The Turkish academics, the petitioners, have used this in slightly different words. We're not going to be part of this crime, not in our name. This moment of self-determination, I think, is very inspiring, if I may say so. Now, talking about women in black, I think what's important here is to see how their politics of appearing cannot be exhaustively defined by a frame of visibility. So the political space is brought forward as people assemble and come together and get, so that the space, the civil space, is inspired by, it's breathed in other words, by singular bodies on the ground, which makes me think of something that Adriana Cavarero has written, and it's what she calls thinking done with the lungs. This thinking done with the bodies in public or otherwise is very interesting. And the way in which the reason I'm attending here to the figure of breathing, especially imperiled breathing, is that I believe it may have some resources to offer in our attempt to grapple with this question of how to perform a critical living, a critical acting and thinking, and how to act actually from this and with this disposition of anxiety. I mean, we tend to think that, you know, we have first, you know, deal with anxiety and then go out and act. But the question is how to act with this disposition of anxiety and how to politicize it, how to... so in this sense, critique, what we call critique, critical epistemologies, critical theories perform a transformative mode of survival, I think. And what's at stake here is the sense of political possibility that comes with the appeal for breadth in these times. But I would like to say just a few words on institutions as spaces to breathe or as suffocating spaces, right? So it's the question for me is how to defend even an institution which is not defendable in its own right, right? I mean, how to reappropriate an institution as a breathing space or as a space to breathe. So I think it's interesting to think how defending those institutions, let's say universities, departments of humanities, social sciences, especially departments of critical epistemologies like gender studies, queer studies, decolonial studies, how this gesture of defending these institutions come along with a gesture of transforming them. So in this sense, defending here is not about defending or preserving what is already there, but rather defending the possibility of transforming these institutions, of, I would say, democratizing these institutions or decolonizing these institutions. Because I think there's a danger here if we're, you know, we're backs on the corner. Sometimes we get very, you know, possessive of our spaces. I think that would be a huge defeat. And what is important here to open up those spaces, to let them breathe, and to open them up to the public, to the society, and therefore not let them, you know, suffocate by the rules of the market. To this extent, I think that critique is what opens up the present to incalculable temporalities, and I think it allows for what I would call the not yet to inspire, to breathe in the eventness of the present. It reactivates the present. Especially in these times of precarity and resurging neo-fascism, I think this is very important because especially for subjects who are exposed to deportability, violence, racism, I think this is the historical responsibility of critical theories, including notably decolonial feminist Marxist critical theories, to reimagine and to reactivate an agonistic critique of the present. But the question of institution is quite important, and I think it takes a lot of work because, I mean, we have so many reasons to be critical of the institutions. But when our institutions are under attack by, you know, the wrong people, then we are compelled in a way to defend them. But for me, the political and ethical question is how to defend them. In what terms, in what ways?
Thank you. Then I think I would like to move on with something which you mentioned, and it's relevant to what you just said about institutions. So we often thought about institution of, I would call it here really institution of internet, something which is really opening the spaces, about many new forms of communication which we have that are democratizing somehow the process of acquiring knowledge, of providing information, but at the same time, in recent period, with all what is happening with these modes of communication, especially when we know about Cambridge Analytica and everything, we see some kind of perverting this institution, and we see that it's becoming also one of the places where we see or hear many things, but basically we cannot or see what is really right information. So what do you think, what could be said about the role of academic community in helping us to distinguish between what is right and wrong information and what is value, what is interest, how we can basically build our attitudes over these new forms, or not anymore new forms of communication, which are somehow instead, as we believed, helping us, now maybe they are actually obstacle to the fight for critical thought and open spaces.
I presume you're asking me because
yes,
this is my obsessive
yes, exactly.
theme. Thanks. And just to wrap up this Adorno thing, his theory was his praxis. Huh? That was the understanding, his understanding of what has been going on. And then Peter Zondi came and then asked him questions, and he was, he died in 69 of a heart attack. And we might even say that this was the process during 68 and 69 that brought him to this end. But when you when you mention new technologies and this world that we are living in today, this is in a form quite opposite to my understanding of knowledge, or what is considered as knowledge for me, because you need time and risk to get any knowledge. Time, you need to read, you need to write, you need to spend a lot of time on a spot. And the internet is the opposite of it. This is what we get. And then we are suffocating under the information that we get from the internet. And this information is reaching us through different layers of the society that we cannot control, starting with this algorithmic or metric modality of providing the information. We were all very happy. I remember being so happy when Google appeared, because it was like a white screen and just one entry, and that was beautiful because it was pure. It was not. It was not messed up with previous portals or whatsoever. But what was it in the background? What has been developed in the background, algorithmically speaking, enabled the future control, or today's control of the information, and also the control how to reach individuals here and there, everywhere. And you mentioned this phenomenon of the Cambridge Analytica as the hugest manipulative strategy that happened. But this Cambridge Analytica dealt with the this engine of producing information even before it happened during the Brexit or with the US elections. They were doing this in Congo, in Philippines, in Azerbaijan, in all these testing regions. And they continued doing those colonial practices known from previous centuries. So, of course, all of a sudden, British Parliament or commissioners, they woke up and they, well, oh, please, we need to question now Mark Zuckerberg, what they are doing, what is it at stake. But when it happened 10 years ago for African countries or some countries so tiny, so non-important for the world, no one knew it. We didn't know, and it was undemocratic, and it was manipulative, and it is the highest level of the corporative capitalism. So this is the danger that we are confronting with gaining the knowledge or producing. I don't know what Michel Foucault will consider as episteme now. I may even think that it would not be the same episteme that he worked upon when doing the archaeology of knowledge. So this is what it is as a dangerous space, and it's a virtual dangerous space or spaces. Yes, this is also demanding a critical thinking, profound critical thinking, because in this matter we need to be all together, which is understanding and supporting strategies of one Edward Snowden or strategies of any of those whistleblowers that are bringing to light the techniques and sophisticated knowledge that most of us probably are not aware of.
You for pointing to this danger and need to be critically evaluated and thought of. I think this is really important, having in mind that especially our younger generations are living more and more space online and internet, and this is the space where we somehow need to approach them also. Before giving the floor to the audience for final questions, I just have one more question for Adriana. We mentioned several times, Judith, you mentioned also, Ivan, you mentioned about attacks on gender programs, on the gender departments. Those who were following this, we have witnessed about canceling the funds for these departments, even canceling the whole departments. And all under some, let's say, claim that these departments are promoting gender ideology. So we discussed many times, but basically I would like to ask you why this is so important for this period for us. Why don't we talk about ideology when we discuss about studies of democracy or
political science, for example?
In general? Why is it that we see basically that academic freedom is mostly endangered or largely endangered in these places where gender studies are under the threat?
What, sorry? The last one?
Gender studies are under the threat. And just they warn me that we should go closer to them.
Okay. So I was really struggling how to answer this. I have some notes, but...
so you knew the question?
I knew the question. I'm sorry.
I'm
from the Institute. I'm sorry. It's one of the privileges. I'm really struggling also because I want to leave as much space as possible. I want to say that in this audience I saw people who were gender studies students, and a lot of them. I also want to say that in this audience I see people who are teachers of gender studies in various ways, and also persons who were very vital for mainstreaming gender in those very good ways. Today we're witnessing also different kinds of gender mainstreaming, but in very good ways, and also people who are now instituting programs which are going to enhance gender in various disciplines. So I think that we have a kind of a living history, and also people who are now doing it and fighting against not only these gender ideology or anti-gender ideology wave, but also against this kind of governmental gender mainstreaming, which I think that is also very dangerous, even though it's not something which happens everywhere, but I think in Serbia we're kind of witnessing to that. So my very short and direct answer to your question would be yes. Gender theorists are in many countries of the world under different kinds of attacks. Somewhere the gender studies departments are shut down, somewhere they're precarized, somewhere they have to fight in order to have their peripheral, very marginal studies somehow put into the discussion at all. But I also think that this topic is a very political one, and it also speaks a lot about the general topic that we are here talking about, the shrinking of this space. So how all of a sudden this kind of, I would say, a social contract that was somehow there during the 90s and to some extent during the first decade of 2000s, which was kind of promoting human rights and stretching the space of human rights and making us somewhat believe in the possibility of critique and how it can go, as Judith said, that there is an open end to research. Somehow all of a sudden now we're witnessing, I would say, a kind of closing of those spaces. And gender is definitely one of these, or as some of the theorists who are really doing their best in trying to understand what is going on with this anti-gender ideology are saying, gender became a kind of a symbolic glue, which somehow glues together very different grievances, economic ones, cultural ones, social ones, political ones, but all of it somehow got together around gender. So I said that I was struggling, and I will now stop with one optimistic thing. I stopped my first answer with a very bleak one, but now, because today we have witnessed one very optimistic and warm and positive set of sentences, not one sentence, by the rector of the University of Belgrade on the occasion of the honorary doctorate award, Judith Butler, who was very positive about the future and the development of gender equality and gender studies and the relevance of gender studies for the University of Belgrade as a whole. And then in that sense, I would really love to stress that goodwill and also prospective, future-oriented way of thinking of the person who's right now the head of the institution that is somehow defending all of us here, or should defend us and make a kind of a lighthouse, as we said in our advertisement for this event, a kind of a lighthouse and also shelter for the academic people.
Thank you, Adriana. I think you were quite brief and to the point. Now I wouldn't take any more of your time. I would like to open the floor for a few questions. We can use from the audience. So there is one more here, and let's say one more hand here as a first round.
Hi, my name is Mihail Alic, and I am the founder of Voice for Men in Serbia, and also Guardians of Equality. I have a, comment on why the government or any funder would interfere or would not give any funds with no strings attached, because academics are not just about sharing knowledge, but it's about sharing ideology. And as government represents the majority of people, they think that gender studies are not in the national interest, and therefore funds may be pulling from those studies. That's my comment.
Okay, a comment. We had one more hand here, and Jelena here. Yes? On the left. Jelena. Yeah. No, you were.
I can.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all very much. It was really inspiring. I've noticed that in general you have a very noble and overall a positive take on academia, right? Which is understandable because of the circumstances we are in. So we are under attack, and there's an attack on academia and academic professors, etc. But I would also say that let us not forget that many of the attacks on critical thinking, on many of the democratic values, come from within academia, right? Jordan Peterson is a professor, is he not? It's just that also one of the ways of shrinking, I would say one of the strategies of how to shrink the space for critical thinking is to bind it solely to academia, right? So it's probably not a good thing for the critical thinking to be thought of inextricably linked to academia. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts of, we live in a globalized, interlinked world, with internet, with all its perils and dangers, but also possibilities. So what are your thoughts on expanding spaces and strategies for enhancing critical thinking outside academic field? Like, do we really have to, defense of academia, defense on attacks on academia is one thing, but do we really need to think of critical thinking as only belonging to academia? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be here tonight, and I have the privilege to hear each and every one of you speak. And this thought occurred to me just as you were finishing up. Basically, it's that I think that maybe we have even too much of critical thought, in a way that literally everyone today is able to feel like a minority in some way. Like, even if you're like heteronormative cis white male in this society, you still have the ability to feel like a minority. And in this way, you can feel endangered. You can feel threatened by whatever that is bigger than your group is. And so what my thought is basically that rather than in further fracturing of our ideas or identities, I feel that there needs to be bigger underlying thought that is connecting us. And that is a way of liberating a space for critical thought and like free thinking and free play, as you've said. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Let's, if somebody wants to take up on any of these comments or questions.
I guess I'd like to respond. Well, I thought all the questions were important, but I want to respond especially to the argument that perhaps the government, in representing the people, determines that gender studies does not serve the national interest. And And then I want to understand, well, I want to know a lot of things about the national interest. But I also want to know how gender studies is understood, because the very term gender ideology is a term that was introduced by the Catholic Church, actually, the Council on the Family, in the 1990s, and then taken up in a series of publications which caricatured the work in the academy and decided it was all one position. It was a single gender ideology, and that it could be characterized in about 3 or 4 sentences, even though for anybody who works in gender studies, we know there are conflicting paradigms, that there are a number of methodologies, that there's enormous research done in the social sciences, in the biological sciences, in literary humanities, and that it's not all the same. It doesn't all converge on the exact same point. There's no one gender ideology. But the way that this notion of a gender ideology was reproduced and circulated, mainly through churches and then into the public sphere, has misrepresented a field. So for a government to decide that gender studies is not in the national interest, it would have to know what gender studies is. And my worry is that it relies only on these highly reductive caricatures without actually studying the field. So as an academic, I would say, look, some academic fields are better than others. You know, some of them have more value than others. I'm more than willing to say that. But we have to study them. We have to actually know what they are. And we have to test the claim. Is this a fair characterization, or is this an anti-intellectual caricature, which is actually obfuscating a much more complex and internally conflicted field with several competing methodologies? And when they say, oh no, it's this, it's like you choose your gender, or there is no difference between woman and man, or this will tear down the heterosexual family. It's like, well, actually, you know, most feminists working in gender studies, most practitioners of gender studies probably wouldn't accept those claims. And it doesn't even come close to what they do. In fact, the bulk of the research in gender studies is on the heterosexual family, and it's on the question of whether families are making a living wage. And that question, which predominates in social science gender studies programs, is in the national interest, regardless of what nation we are talking about, because what has happened to women's work, what has happened to the level of the wage, what is the gender division of labor, how is that being handled, right? So these are really serious questions that any nation needs to think about. I could go on forever, but I won't.
Do we have any comments for other maybe questions? No?
I have a very short comment on Helena's beautiful question, and just to say that I totally agree with you, and I do believe that this talk of we are under attack can be a very problematic and conservative talk, and among other things, it has very severe, undertones of nationalism and regression and all that. So I think the university, and we have to, to acknowledge that it's not all about free circulation of knowledge and free production of knowledge. It's also about tremendous inequalities. It's about white privilege, male privilege. So what is it defendable about the university? Something that needs also and always to be rephrased and reclaimed in a way. So for me at least, it's the most important part here in this gesture of defending is that we're claiming for a position of defending an institution from a position of eccentricity and marginalization. And I think this is, this is, as always, we have open fronts, multiple open fronts. It's not that all together the academics are defending, this is not my experience in Greece. I have to, at the same time, I have to fight, I have to hold the fight with my colleagues who are very conservative and who believe that the humanities are all about the classicist canon and, teaching, about Greece being the cradle of Western civilization. And this is, can we build an alliance there? Sometimes we cannot, it's as simple as that. So that's why I said, I agree with you that, we have to forge links with movements and collectivities of knowledge production outside the university. So for me, when I talk about the university, I talk about, the spirit of the university, and not the, the institution itself, at least the institution as it is, as it exists in the moment. But on the other side, I think it's important to save something to defend the possibility of transforming the university from within at the same time. But, yeah.
Just very, very briefly on the question of critical thinking beyond academia and university. Clearly we're all aware that historically this has been in, to put it simply, cultural journals, in journalism writ large. Thomas Paine, for example, who had a wonderful name for free thinking. He had called the Headstrong Society, which I think portrays what it means. Take Karl Kraus in Vienna with Die Fackel, his journal, which really was spreading all varieties, or today, New York Review of Books or Times Literary Supplement. These are places where Esprit in Paris or Micromega in Italy, these are places where critical thinking happens alone. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not only academia.
I am very for critical thinking, but what is the problem with gender studies? It is no space for males to criticize, no space is any employed in gender studies. Heterosexual male. No, no.
Absolutely.
No. Where is about you? No.
Well, we're not gender studies here. We're doing something else.
Next one. Just to explain.
No, actually, what's interesting to me...
I will test how you allow critical thinking when it is against you. For example. This is text. For example, in Serbia. I cannot understand, because I'm living in Australia, I'm a citizen of Australia, living in States. I cannot understand what is inequality in women's in Serbia when 10 positions by our constitutions, all women's. Just for a second. Prime Minister, women. President of Assembly, women. Minor, just a second.
Okay,
attorney.
I'm sorry. I think we heard. I'm sorry, but I
am asking for question. To please give me critical space for critical your. Just excellent. Attorney General, women. President of Constitutional Court, women. Just a second. Director of Taxation Office, women. Actually, only, just a second. I'm talking to a male in Serbia, like in communist, communist, courts, women's. There is no one man is family court in Serbia. Just to self. No.
Okay,
communist dictators.
We understood.
Communist dictators give to be judges women in order to easier manipulate them. Just talking. I am for gender studies, but to include, for example, that
All right.
Gender professors, just a second, involved
Can
the
we
police.
please take a mic now because we understood the question? Thank you.
Gender studies involve police state in Serbia by allowing the police to give up.
Come on, you guys, we need you.
There is a straight white
Yeah,
man.
we need the solidarity of the straight white men to help us. Okay, you know, I do think, I understand. It sounds like it's getting rougher all the time. And, you know, look, I think it's hard. I think it's truly hard when the world has had men as leaders. The university has been staffed by men as its leaders. The state governments and the local communities have had men running things for a long time, corporations. And you know what? We all got used to that, and it seemed like it was the right way to be because it was the actual way, and it seemed natural and appropriate. And as women started to enter these professions, I think there was a real fear that they would indeed take over and that they would push men out, right? But, you know, I think that it's a question not of monopoly, but of equality. And that means imagining a world in which a man can do as good a job as a woman in caretaking, as a nurse. A woman can do as good a job as a man, as somebody who runs a university. And you know what? It's hard. It pushes against some old, deep ways of organizing the world in one's mind. And it is something of a scandal. And I believe, as I travel the world, that there are many people who do believe that this is a very frightening phenomenon, that equality is frightening, that freedom is frightening, and that even though we believe in equality, we believe in freedom, the actual embodiment of those abstractions is a different world. For some, it is exhilarating, and for some, it is very frightening and very worrisome, because what is stable in one's life becomes unstable. Now, what I believe is that there are many things that are making our lives unstable at this time, and some of them actually have to do with economic processes that are out of our control, climate change that is out of our control. I would also say that when we start these microaggressions, like, oh, you know, the cis man is, the cis heterosexual man is now oppressed or is the oppressor, or, you know, we've lost our way. We've lost the larger things, and we start to fight at that level, at the micro level, because we have no idea how to intervene on the larger issues. And we are fatalistic and frightened. So what I'm identifying with in what this gentleman is saying is that he is registering a changing world which challenges the way he has understood things, how things ought to be. And I think we need to address that kind of anxiety. I think a lot of kids have it, a lot of people who go to church have it, a lot of people who have different kinds of backgrounds, and we can't just speak to ourselves. We actually need to maybe get out there and explain what gender is or what it isn't, and why men are always welcome, and why it actually will produce a better world for men, because they will have a greater choice about how to live their lives, what kind of work to pursue, how to understand themselves, their own emotional capacity, their capacities for love and connection. I think it's better for, well, this will be outrageous, so it's better for both genders and for all the other genders too.
We have a question.
Just before giving the floor to two last questions which we have, I just want to say something, because I also think that it's important to emphasize that men are always welcome in any field, especially gender field, is that we had discussion and we are doing something in founding what we call Gender Academic Network here. And the main issue which we, people here from the Institute, stand for is that men should be and has to be part of this. So this should be maybe emphasized more in order to answer questions like that. And in response to why we have so many females in some professions, I think that's discussion which we can take for long, and it's not in the field of identity, it's in some other fields. Okay.
Mogu ja samo da kratko, but I also want to add on what Gazela said, and also what Judith wonderfully put, that we also have some kind of space for us to not always care, like women, what men want. So if they want to come, they can come. Also about the cis men, and they have to let us.
Yeah, but what if you don't know if you're a woman?
Yeah,
can you still
it's
come?
true. Yeah, well, that's true.
I mean, I had trouble getting in some of those doors.
And then why division? Why division? Huh? Let's think from the point of view of the multitude. What is it? What was I when I was a child, and then through puberty, and then as a woman in her 30s, or as a woman in her 50s and 60s? It's changing. Everything is changing. So am I going to say that I'm the same as I was when I was 13 or 17? No.
Okay. We had one more hand here, and is that it? One there. Okay, let's take those two questions and then we close for tonight. Mike, please. Where is the mic? Please.
So can I start with my question then?
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this great panel, and actually for this great final answer. And I could just start another question based on that. But I wanted to start my question with the observation that ELTE, the university that lost its gender accreditation, the official justification for it was that it was not financially solvable. That is, that there weren't enough students interested in taking gender studies classes at the university for the state to fund such a department. And that, I think, is a very crucial thing to think about, the ways in which universities, and especially while you were all talking, I kept thinking back to Wendy Brown's book, Undoing the Demos. The question becomes, who are we educating? Are we educating the Homo economicus, the future worker that's going to work, say, in the IT sector? And then for that person, maybe it's not as important to think about all of the questions that you just raised in the final 5 minutes. But if we're educating the citizens, the demos, then yes, that becomes important. When I was a TA a few years back, I just read that book, and Wendy Brown actually speaks about it, especially in her chapter on educating human capital, that this is happening at universities, that budget lines are becoming more about how many seats we can fill rather than how we're educating our youths. And I think this is our role as academics as well. We're thinking beyond the university, creating spaces for critical thought that comes from us. So I had this book. I was very enthusiastic. I came to my undergraduate students I was a TA in intercultural anthropology, and we're fighting to keep our numbers up. And this is an American university. And I asked them, why aren't you revolting? Why aren't you out in the streets? Well, I'm working 2 jobs. I'm tired. I can't do it. And then at the same time, a lot of us junior academics and scholars are finding it difficult to find spaces to actually speak and produce knowledge. Adjuncts are working triple jobs in order to... Yeah. So right now, I think MAS here in Serbia is a good example. Unions, adjunct unions and graduate student unions in the United States, but they're coming against huge fires. So my question is, how do we, create these spaces or fight against this shrinkage of space while still living in a very precarious situation of our own?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question.
And let's hear here, and then we can turn to the panelists. Can we pass just the mic, please?
Oh, here is it? Okay. Thank you.
Hi. I would like to pick up on the point of sort of the dichotomy between academia and politics, which I've always found very interesting, especially because I now work in opposition politics here, and I am also a researcher. And from both of these fields that I work in, I feel a lot of derision towards the other side. And also, you know, looking at the participant list here, I saw a very long list in institutions of faculty of going all the way down. And I would really like to know how you think that we can kind of create more of a conversation between academia and politicians, in many cases opposition politicians. But, you know, I think, especially here in Serbia, the opposition needs a lot of fresh ideas and fresh plans, and if we can create a conversation like that, we can get a stronger opposition and work together to, you know, to counter the oppression that we're facing at the moment.
Thank you. Okay. Please.
Just very briefly, because time is running out, and I'm sure the stomachs are talking to you right now. Your question about the gig economy and the precariousness and what globalization and the neoliberal economy have done is certainly a subject that warrants at least 5 more panels like this, because that is really the framing question in which we are living. And it goes to what Sonia was saying about, you know, the internet and the IT pervasiveness and the way that we are slaves. Those who have worked in institutions, you're basically working all the time. On Saturday and Sunday, you're getting emails. There's an expectation, at least when I worked in the US, that you had to be online all the time. So there's, you know, free time is one of these key issues. And the response of your students, I've had similar responses. So I think that, you know, whether this whole, it questions the whole model of civilization that we live in. You know, does one need a second car? Robert Skidelsky has written this book, How Much Enough is Enough? You know, do we need that extra all the time? And is the profit incentive the one that will drive the world forward? Or do we need to start rethinking things beyond changing a diesel and petrol car to an electric car? Is that enough to address these issues of the global commons? So this whole question that we're addressing here of critical thinking is a crucial one. I remember, you know, and those who are in academia know it, that an American education expert said, well, basically it's what you said, you know, 95% of people that we're preparing are for jobs. 5% are those lucky who are studying philosophy and history and, you know, get critical thinking. But I think it's crucial that those who are in sort of a vocational stream of education get the necessary civic education and critical thinking approach, not to replicate what the professor is saying, but to start thinking by yourself. And that is a huge question where both states and private companies need to be thinking about.
I would just say that one of the effects of neoliberalism and the outsourcing of adjunct labor and the is that most faculty who are now not on tenured lines don't have the opportunity to unionize, and they don't have the same labor rights as people with tenure. And I think it's really important that contingent faculty get organizations together where they can think about what their work conditions are and make demands on the basis of that. So I think that we have to understand that one of the effects of the neoliberalization of the academy that Wendy Brown has described is also the breaking up of unions, or the foreclosure of unions. The other thing I would say is that when we think about, we ask the question of academics in relationship to politics. Well, sometimes politics is political parties. and one of the problems there is that the political parties want you to do what they want to do for their political purposes. But sometimes politics includes civic organizations or networks or community organizations or other kinds of gatherings or institutions that are trying to figure out like the basic political question, namely, how do we want to live together and how do we want to organize our lives? Can we make a world together that we also want to inhabit? And so environmental organizations are also part of a political field, and they're not just NGOs, and they may or may not have an active relationship to elected officials or partisan politics in that way. But I think we have to remember that the sphere of politics and even the politics of the university that we're talking about is much greater than electoral politics.
Anyone else? No? Then I just want for the end to say that actually this event was in a way creating the space for discussion and for critical thinking. And I really hope that, having in mind that we had here representative of also civil society and political parties with us, that also inspires some critical acting which can come after this discussion. And I hope this will be just one first in the road that is, which is intention of as well institute, but I would say key intention of the MASA as a network is to bring the voice back to academia when it comes to really socially important issues. And when we say that we focused here on academia as something which is relevant for us as academic community, because we need to build inside of our community the solidarity and the group of, let's say, engaged people who would like to be open and active. So this is the purpose, and this event is just a starting point for this process. At least I hope so. So thanking panelists at the first place. I'm also thanking you for staying with us these 2.5 hours and participating in discussion. I hope that we are going to see each other on some brighter occasions also in the future. Thank you.
And thank you, Gazala. Thank you, Gazala.